Envision falling through a small opening in a frozen lake, entering a tight, totally dull section, loaded up with frosty water and plummeting north of 400 ft, or 120 m. This is precisely exact thing 5 reckless completion jumpers did in February 2014. Things went well right off the bat, however, a progression of flowing occasions changed everything quickly then, as their companions' lives remained in a precarious situation. The jumpers confronted unbelievably terrible choices. This is the sickening story of the Plura cave debacle. Less watchfulness is exhorted. Kai Keenan is a notable Finnish jumper who cut his teeth at the quarry. However, he encountered his most memorable submerged misfortune while plunging with a long-lasting companion at one more close-by quarry in 2013. Not long after the two entered the water, Key saw that his accomplice wasn't moving and his controller had dropped out of his mouth. Kay promptly maneuvered him back onto the ice, started revival, and called crisis administrations. A salvage helicopter showed up not long after that, yet by then his companion was dead. A post-mishap examination uncovered that he'd essentially neglected to open the oxygen valve on his rebreather. Kai was distressed over the episode and promised to surrender cave jumping for good, yet by then it had turned into an energy that he was unable to leave. Not long after that occurrence, Kai immediately got back to the water with companions and individual jumpers, Patrick Risk, Jari Rainin, and Vasa Rainin. Still, his timing could never have been any more regrettable. Very quickly, he saw one more deadly mishap over a wreck close to Estonia. One of his kindred jumpers vanished while dropping toward the wreck that day. Salvage jumpers were brought in to look for the missing man, yet their endeavors were fruitless. Later, Kai and 2 others found his dormant body in around 230 ft 70 m of water. Yet even with 2 new misfortunes, Key actually couldn't surrender cave plunging, and only a couple months after the fact, he started arranging another plunge. This would yet be his most hazardous testing, and actually requesting jump. Norway's Plura stream begins in Lake Sinat and twists through the Grand Plura Valley. It's widely viewed as Northern Europe's biggest water-filled normal cavern. Actually, all things being equal, Norwegians didn't start investigating it until the mid-90s, on the grounds that before then, the accessible jumping gear simply didn't depend on task. Then, with further developed and powerful hardware, jumpers were starting to wander further into the cavern than any time in recent memory. In mid-2014, Kai and 4 other Finnish jumpers were going to leave on one more awe-inspiring plunge at the Plura Cave complex. Kai would be joined by 42-year-old firefighter Patrick, 40-year-old creation supervisor Jari, and 33-year-old electrical planner Visa, and 34-year-old mechanical designer Eirid Yaru. Every one of the 5 were confirmed cavern jumpers and experienced specialized jumpers. This intended that as per public and worldwide principles, they were completely able to embrace such an aggressive cavern plunge that would take them in excess of 320 ft, or 100 mers beneath the outer layer of the Plura stream. A couple of years sooner, Kai and Jari had established an informal completion record by jumping 688 f 210 m in the Halala quarry in eastern Finland. Furthermore, Kai and Patrick had as of now crossed the entry that associated the Plura cavern's 2 known passageways. The past fall with such a lot of involvement under their belts, they were justifiably certain that they could pull it off again. Yet this time, they do the cross the other way. The underlying plummet to the Plura opening must be made underneath the outer layer of a little lake. The arrangement was to break into 2 gatherings, with start time staggered 2 hours, separated. In the event that all went well, they'd navigate in around 5 hours and be back home, no problem at all. Late the following day, the men moved into Jar's van on February 5, 2014. The trailer hitched to the van, stacked with a snowmobile, submerged bikes, many plunging chambers, and numerous Extra miscellaneous items during the excursion through Finland, Sweden and Norway. The restless jumpers pored over everything about their arrangement to guarantee the trip was protected and effective. Then only a couple of hours from their last objective, the snow and ice-covered streets turned out to be progressively dangerous and slippery. At one point, Jari scarcely recaptured control of the B seconds before it greened into a trench. After the episode, the stunned tenants shared a couple of anxious chuckles and recognized their favorable luck prior to halting for a good breakfast of bacon and eggs. Then, almost 16 hours after the excursion started, they showed up at Passage Brew Homestead right off the bat February 6, prior to resigning to their rooms. They industriously conveyed the most delicate stuff into the carport so it wouldn't be frozen strong the next morning. When required, subsequently, Jari chose to hit the hay while the others partook in some merited lagers. Prior to turning in themselves, they consented to snooze until 8:00 a.m. to guarantee they got a lot of rest. When they woke, the temperature had decreased to well beneath freezing, and the sun didn't show up until 9:00 a.m. The men were isolated into two gatherings. The first included Patrick and Jari. They had entered the cavern first, and after 2 hours, Kivisa and Jari would follow them in similar heading. The stunned takeoffs would permit the silt worked up by the primary gathering to settle. At the point when the subsequent gathering entered the cavern, yet more significantly, it would permit one gathering to help the other in the event that something turned out badly. As the 10th hour gravitated toward Gaviesa, and Jari started setting up the stuff, while Patrick and Jari started up the trimming tool and started cutting an opening in the ice-covered lake. When they at last penetrated through the thick layer of ice, they were satisfied to find the water was obvious to such an extent that they could see the rough base, almost 60 fu or 80 m down. The jumpers were in especially positive feelings with first-rate conditions. More than adequate wrist and full guts. As they worked, Patrick took a video of himself and Jari making last arrangements. Then, as Jari sped up the rear of Patrick's dry suit, he inquired as to whether he naturally suspected they ought to proceed the plunge. Jari answered by motioning down toward the water with his right hand. The importance was clear. We're going then. Only a couple of moments. Evening. Patrick pointed his camera at the opening in the ice, and Jari slipped himself into the freezing water, starting off behind schedule. Was certainly not a good thought, yet it didn't appear to be an enormous arrangement. Since I was simply expected to require around 5 hours. Having completed their arrangements, Kai and Yaru showed up to wish Patrick and Jari best of luck minutes before they started up their submerged bikes and started dropping towards the entry of the lowered cavern. The submerged bikes seemed to be gimmicky contraptions from an old James Bond film. Still, they were fundamental devices since they permitted the jumpers to move rapidly and cover more ground while monitoring valuable energy. As they worked their direction down the cavern, the men likewise utilized shut-circuit stuff or rebreathers rather than conventional open-circuit gear. The thing that matters is that with closed-circuit hardware, breathed-out gases aren't released into the water. Rather, scrubbers eliminate the carbon dioxide, after which a combination of new oxygen, nitrogen, what's more, helium are recycled to the jumper through their controller, known as the Tri-X. This indispensable three-gas blend can be changed relying upon plunge profundity, individual inclination, and a few different factors. However, even with the most recent and most progressive stuff, the men must be perceptive of a few age-old dangers, one of which was hypercapnia, is by and large caused while a breaking down rebreather unit neglects to eliminate the carbon dioxide breathed out by the jumper. This prompts risky developments of carbon dioxide in the blood, prompting wooziness, bewilderment, weakness, and sickness. Shut-circuit rebreathing frameworks can essentially expand the time jumpers stay lowered. However, they likewise have a few serious downsides since they're more mind-boggling. They're likewise more inclined to glitch. Furthermore, when not appropriately acclimated to every individual, The tricks can cause jumpers to feel all the more certain, and in some cases, somewhat euphoric. These sentiments can prompt unfortunate choices and superfluous gamble-taking. Patrick and Yari H had utilized rebreathers previously, yet they chose to convey an extra unit and additional chambers in the event that their essential hardware flopped. Now inside the cavern entrance, they step by step plunged over in excess of 1600 FD 500 MPa 800 and 250 m long chamber that was fundamentally loaded up with water in the wake of pausing for a minute top. Value their wonderful environmental elements, they went on down to a profundity of almost 420 ft, or 130 m. Surrounding them were porous limestone walls with scar-stamped precipices, whole and shadowy side sections, presently completely dedicated and powered by the adrenaline flowing through their veins. They moved toward the most profound segment of the cavern. Once there, they connected rules to a plate secured to the wall by Kai and Sammy, who had recently set it up in the cavern. As well as denoting the date, the plates expressed that it had been put there by Blades. Furthermore, not local Norwegians. Next, the entry started a long climb, prompting the other cavern entrance, or the exit, under 330 ft, or 1000 m away. Patrick and Yari could see the supposed reason to have some hope, yet they actually needed to go through an especially limited segment that made a tight 90 turn. Patrick went through first, yet as he went to the corner he neglected to focus on the light from Yar's headlamp. This wasn't a shock yet to be protected. He convoluted and looked around the corner to ensure his companion was still not far behind him. Patrick restored eye-to-eye connection with Yari, yet he promptly saw that the light emission from his headlamp was going all over. Sporadically, this was disturbing on the grounds that it was a generally perceived indication of an upset jumper. Patrick motioned and shouted for Yar to come toward him. Yet when his companion didn't move, he switched and made a beeline for him, rather head presently up close and personal, only a couple of meters from the limited section. Yari requested that Patrick move his bike in spare chamber far removed, since they were hindering his way. Patrick moved them to around 30 ft or 90 m up the section, yet Yari actually didn't move from his unique position, and by then he'd turn out to be discernibly disturbed. Patrick didn't know what was going on until he saw Yari bike line wedged in a hole behind two rocks. Yari pulled it free with a strong pull when he motioned to the line and started creeping towards his companion. Yari was at last unstuck and moving in the correct course once more, yet he over and over motioned for Patrick to give him the open-circuit reinforcement tank. Patrick gave him the controller a few times, after which Yari changed back to his own rebreather. However, after this time, Patrick saw Yar's controller had tumbled from his mouth. He then gave Yari his own controller and squeezed the cleanse button. However, in such an unsettled state, Yari breathed in excessively fast and sucked in an enormous amount of freezing cave water. When his face bended into a horrendous frown, Patrick realized that there was no way to save him. Patrick was no more peculiar to jumpers in trouble. He'd even by and by seen and recovered dead jumpers. However, this was undeniably more private. Steadying himself on a close-by rock, he attempted to resist the urge to panic. While cautiously considering his choices, he realized that his life was presently in peril. First, he checked out at the plunge PC to perceive what amount of time his rising would require and the number of stops that he'd need to make en route. To his shock, it demonstrated his climb would take more than 400 minutes or almost 7 hours. When he checked what felt like only a couple of moments before the assessed climb time was only 120 minutes as a guideline consistently spent at profundities more noteworthy than 360 FD or 110 m adds something like 10 minutes to the all-out length of the plunge. Considering this, Patrick expected that he'd spent around 25 minutes longer in the section than he initially suspected. In crises like this, jumpers are frequently enticed to climb undeniably more rapidly than they ought to anyway. Thusly, they fundamentally expanded the gamble of deadly decompression disorder, now with his companion's body hindering the entry and an agonizing rising. In front of him, Atri couldn't just swim to the surface and let the other three jumpers in the subsequent gathering know what had happened more regrettable. Yet he'd even given Yari his very own portion valuable oxygen. This intended that there was a decent opportunity that he wouldn't have enough to last to the furthest limit of this unbearably lengthy brief rising one way or the other. He got no opportunity except for to swim towards the entry and stick to the cavern PC's climb plan. As intently as conceivable as Patrick swam away, he really wanted to think about what might happen to Kai, Vesa, and Yaru when they arrived at Yariage's body in the cavern obstructing the way mage, a couple of hours after the fact. Unfortunately, he'd figured they'd likely all pass on, and assuming he set head spinning and survived the ordeal, he'd need to drive back to Finland without help from anyone else and illuminate his companions' families that their children, fathers, and spouses were dead in the meantime at approximately 2:00 p.m. Kaveza and Yaru brought down themselves through the opening in the ice and started advancing towards the far-off cave entrance. Kai demanded being rearward in line, since he needed to have the option to help the others. Assuming that something turned out badly, the three jumpers made great time and came to the enormous air-filled chamber around 20 minutes after the fact. With assistance from the bailout chambers left by the past gathering, they figured they could make the remainder of the cross in just 4 hours anyway. Vasa was burdened by the extra reinforcement chambers he'd brought, against the desires of the other people, who let him know that he wouldn't require them now at a profundity of 410 ft or 125 m. The chambers kept him from traveling through the especially restricted part of the section, and keeping in mind that he was stuck, one of his blades got tragically tangled in one of it. The rules Vesa eliminated a few chambers and Yaru unraveled his balance. Yet the episode cost them 5 extra minutes. This slight postpone implied that their plunge time had recently expanded by almost an hour, and Kei and Yaru were disturbed about making extra decompression pauses and investing considerably more energy in the cold water. All things being equal, they trusted they could clear their path through the cavern's tightest point prior to beginning a generally uninteresting rising. Then soon after they began moving again, Fayasa heard an obvious pain blare coming from a close-by breathing device. Only seconds after the fact, he spotted Yori's dormant body wedged clumsily in a 90 curve. He yelled to Kai and Yaru that Yari had all the marks of being dead and that his body was obstructing their direction. Now they confronted the unexpected setbacks, since they'd need to eliminate their stuff to get any opportunity of slipping past him through the limited opening right now. Things got murky, yet everybody was obviously in shock, and Kai was at that point experiencing nitrogen narcosis. Nitrogen narcosis can give jumpers a mind-boggling feeling of quiet in any event during perilous episodes. Then again, it can debilitate judgment and coordinated movements and cause bewilderment and frenzy. Kai didn't know whether Yar-Ag was dead, since he wasn't thinking plainly, and speaking with his kindred jumpers was challenging, no doubt. Anyway, he saw that Yaru was swimming curiously and exchanging to and fro between his shut-circuit and open-circuit bailout frameworks. Something was extremely off base, and a couple of moments later, his body became limp and dormant. Even in his shaky mental state, Kai realized that he was unable to bear to stick around to help his companions, who are at any rate in far more regrettable shape than he was, and perhaps currently dead then. At that point, soon after getting away from the terrible scene, he also saw Yari, his body wedged in the entry to exacerbate the situation. Faso was kicking savagely, attempting to get around it. Kai didn't figure Faso would work everything out such that he yelled for everybody to pivot and head back the manner in which they came. Fisa heard him, yet he tried not pivot, since he dreaded running out of air prior to coming to the surface. With undeniable frenzy setting in faces taking in oxygen utilization, expanded quickly. Kai needed to pursue a split choice on the grounds. What is happening was turning out to be more critical continuously. He could either keep close by and attempt to help Vasa, or just let him alone and fight for himself. Kai at last picked the stepping stool, and with that he pivoted and started climbing towards the initial. They had entered toward the start of the plunge. He knew that the initial minute decompression stop must be made at a profundity of 330 ft or 110 m. However, each extra stop would be longer than the one going before it. Kai didn't know whether he'd have sufficient oxygen on the off chance that he followed the PC created climb plan, so he chosen to gamble with decompression disorder as opposed to kicking the bucket and excruciating demise by suffocating. When he at last came to the long air-filled chamber, he considered gnawing his time there until heroes came for him. With a little calmer, the oxygen in the chamber could keep him alive for quite a long time. However, in the event that, yet again, no other person survived the cavern, there was no telling when or regardless of whether a salvage would be started. He chose to continue to move. However, when his submerged bike passed on, his irredeemable circumstance turned out to be considerably more illogical. Despite such overpowering chances, he really wanted to harp on the family sitting tight for him back home. What Kai didn't know was Patrick was finishing his own multi-hour rising on the opposite side of the entry, with quickly lessening battery power. He needed to pick between warming his warm vest or pushing himself forward. Utilizing his submerged bike, he generally picked portability over warmth, and when he got cold, he kicked his legs and waved his arms to keep the blood streaming until his next stop. In the meantime, Faso was making his own decompression stops not excessively far behind him during his painful rising. Faso was blameworthy to such an extent that he was unable to help his stricken companions. By then he'd been in the water for 6 hours. Unlike the others, he was arriving at the external furthest reaches of his air supply now. The three men were making their rising stops uninformed that the others were alive and doing likewise. It seemed like all trust was almost lost, and the frightening trial could continue forever. Then 6 hours from the surface, Kai had barely a choice, however, to open the valve on his last air chamber. He experienced difficulty making out the small potter on the measure, so he didn't know how much air was avoided. Close by, Patrick and Vasa are running with regard to oxygen, and as of now, not ready to make all the vital decompression stops. All things considered, Patrick at last broke the surface simply a few moments past 900 p.m., around an hour and a half sooner than the plunge PCs proposed to send. Patrick's jump had endured 8 and 1/2 hours, rather than the first 5 hours they had expected. Depleted, he plunked down close to the cavern access to hang tight for Vasa, who he trusted was still someplace behind him, rummaging through his companions' knapsacks, searching for something to eat and drink. He in the end saw the light from Vasa's headlamp arising through the dimness. 3 hours after the fact, Kai rose up out of the cavern entrance also and swam towards the outer layer of the ice-covered lake. He pointed his light at the layer of ice above him and started to search for the plunge opening. Yet he right away acknowledged it had frozen over starting from the morning. Fortunately, he did track down it and broke as he would prefer through the ice, and propelled himself and his stuff up and out of the water. By then it was around 10 a.m. In the first part of the day, his jump endured a surprising 11 and 2 hours. However, without any indication of his kindred jumpers dreading the most horrendously terrible, he strolled to the van, turned on the motor, turned on the headlights, and fallen onto the floor. By then Patrick and Vasa changed into dry garments and got back to the lake after forever. Without indication of the others, they at long last separated and called Norwegian specialists. Then after 2 p.m., they saw that the van was sitting and the lights were on, going through the freezing air in inky murkiness. They found shuddering on the floor, sure that he was the main survivor, Kai, accepted that there were interested local people who come to explore the secretive van with unfamiliar plates. Kai, Patrick, and Vasa were promptly hospitalized, while insight about the passing spread rapidly. Even after an extended stay at a nearby medical clinic, Vasa kept on experiencing issues strolling, and he was tormented by a baffling shivering all around his body of the 3K. Experienced the most pessimistic scenario of tension, yet like the others he was anxious to get back to Norway as fast as conceivable. In the meantime, the police examined what occurred when the disastrous jump campaign specialists scrutinized the 3 survivors various times and eventually resolved what should have already been common knowledge, that the 2 Yaris had passed on in a horrendous mishap that had in short order spiraled wild. Furthermore, specialists needed to sort out whether or not and how the casualties' bodies would be recovered. From the cavern, they recruited 3 English jumpers to design and execute the interesting recuperation activity. With no other practical choice, sometime thereafter, the Brits slipped into the cavern. Through the entry they found the 2 bodies, precisely where different jumpers said they would be. Nevertheless, they couldn't remove them and eventually surrendered on the grounds that the activity was simply too perilous. Thus, neighborhood authorities chose to leave the bodies where they were and close the matter for the last time. After subtleties of the Orwing misfortune had been delivered, they trusted no other person could at any point endeavor to make the cross between the 2 cavern openings anyway. When Patrick heard that the bodies wouldn't be recuperated, he circumspectly reached a couple of jumping companions to check whether they'd be keen on assisting him with doing it. Everybody concurred, and the gathering of decided blades subtly assembled at the cavern entrance on spring 26. The recuperation activity must be held inconspicuous so nearby specialists wouldn't show up startlingly and shut down it. After a concise quiet, they entered the cavern from the 2 closures and set multiple dozen bailout chambers along the section. Moreover, they laid out a submerged living space in which depleted jumpers could rest while playing out their decompression stops. Patrick and Sammy recovered the assortments of the 2 jumpers. FASA wasn't permitted to plunge because of decompression infection, yet he helped the activity from the top side. The next morning, the group advised nearby specialists that the departed men's bodies had been recuperated and required to have been moved away from the jump site. The generally secret activity at last drew a lot of consideration from neighborhood and public media sources in Norway, Finland, and Europe. However, albeit the recuperation exertion was against true requests, no move was made against the heroes. Surprisingly, a brief time frame later, Kai, Patrick, and Basa were once again at it again, stacking their stuff into Kai's van. Not long prior to going out on a multi-week cave plunging trip in France and Spain, the excursion had previously been arranged during the Plura cave fiasco. They pondered cancelling it and surrendering cave plunging for good. However, as is commonly said, sometimes people change. But don't count on it. I need to say thank you for going along with me today, and in the event that this story moves you, if it's not too much trouble, think about enjoying the video and buying into our channel. I'm anticipating seeing you at the following episode.